Centuries of Oppression, the Road to the 1918 Representation of the People Act. A centenary will be celebrated in the UK in February 2018. It very much deserves to be celebrated. It will be the centenary of an Act of Parliament, the Representation of the People Act 1918. This is the Act which gave the vote to the majority of women for the first time in the UK. But this is not the only reason to celebrate, or even the most significant reason. The 1918 Act should be celebrated for something more fundamental. It should be celebrated for the triumph of democracy. Democracy in this context being understood as the right of all adult citizens to vote to elect their leaders. It has been forgotten that until that time, democracy in this egalitarian sense had been widely regarded as a radical, even subversive idea. The phrase centuries of oppression is often used in the context of the situation before 1918. Well, if you must have a soundbite version of history, then centuries of oppression might do as well as anything. But it was not oppression of women by men, as some now appear to believe. It was the oppression of the many by the few. And the many were of both sexes, and the few were of both sexes. I have not conducted a poll, but I feel fairly sure that to most people the phrase universal suffrage will be taken to mean votes for women. The popular belief may be summarised as follows. Before the suffragette movement, women did not have the vote. Before the suffragette movement, men did have the vote. And finally, that the suffragettes won the vote for women. I will argue in this history that these three statements are, respectively, not entirely true, grossly misleading, and just plain wrong. The history of universal suffrage is the history of the working class struggle, not just votes for women. Men too had to fight for the vote. In fact, men had to literally, not only metaphorically, fight for the vote. Vast numbers of men died in the process. The suffragettes' imprisonment and hunger strikes are well known. The huge numbers of men imprisoned, transported to penal colonies, killed in warfare, or executed in pursuit of their parallel cause in earlier centuries is forgotten, and the role of World War I in the final stages of the struggle largely unappreciated. So the centenary of the Representation of the People Act 1918 should not only be celebrated as giving the vote to women. Whilst true, this is also seriously misleading. The Act should primarily be celebrated as having overturned the class-based franchise and granted universal suffrage to both sexes. That the Act is now presented to us purely as votes for women says more about present-day gender political bias than it does about historical truth. The history of universal suffrage tends to be presented to us now purely as a gender issue, but in reality there was very little difference in the acquisition of universal suffrage by men and women when viewed on an historical timescale. The triumph of women in winning the vote was absolutely dependent upon men having pioneered that democratic struggle. Nowhere is that more clear than in the suffragette era, though the truth of that period has been replaced in the public mind by myth. Here I attempt to exorcise that myth and replace it with a more balanced account. I would say true account, were I not aware of how problematic that word is when applied to a complex history. For those who are emotionally wedded to the story of brave women triumphing over an hegemony of brutish oppressive men, you will not like my version of events. But those who would prefer a story of men and women working mostly in harmony against a common class enemy will, I hope, like it rather better. To start the tale of the rise of democracy in the suffragette era would be to open the book at the last chapter. In truth, the 1918 Act was the culmination of many centuries of struggle for fair representation. Struggle, that is, mostly by men, apart from the final few decades when women became more prominent. Just a few years before Victoria came to the throne, 96% of adult men still did not have the vote, and working men had already spent many centuries intermittently fighting for better conditions, including universal suffrage. The last chapter the suffragette era may be, but it is that last chapter which has become most seriously misrepresented in the public mind. So it will be on the suffragette era that I will ultimately focus most attention, but not before spending a little time doing some measure of justice to the deeper history.